That's a tremendous question, and the person who asks it is needlessly modest, I think. I wish that I wish that a great lot of more people, including people who teach in the humanities in colleges, had that degree of historical awareness, even to ask a question like that. Augustus tried to encourage the people of his time, especially in his case, the aristocrats, the senatorial class, to recover what were considered the virtues of ancient republican Rome. So central virtue there was pietas, that is, doing your duty for before the gods and your household gods and the father of your family and your country, right? That meant, specifically for the senatorial class, get married, okay? Get married already. Too many bachelors because they didn't want to have kids, they didn't want the burden or the responsibility, they didn't want to divide their property. Augustus passed laws that would penalize them, okay? If you're not married by age 30, you've got to pay a big fine. He tried to set an example in his own family. Augustus sexually was, he did not have the extraordinary vices that we associate with the worst of the upper class in ancient Rome or even Hellenistic Greece. He didn't have that. He didn't debauch boys, for instance. He's a little bit of a womanizer, not as bad as a lot of people. But he tried to have the model family for everybody else. You know, didn't work out in his own family. His daughter Julia had adulterous affairs. Augustus finally found out about them, couldn't put a lid on it, and had her banished from the Italian mainland, banished to a little rocky island, Pondicherry, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, and never allowed Julia to return to Rome. She died there, died in exile, died an outcast. Didn't work in his own family, and it didn't seem to work in the successors, the immediate successors of Augustus. But it did set a tone for future generations. That is, Rome would always look back upon the virtues of republican Rome as they were described by the two guys that Augustus Caesar really pushed to promote these old virtues. That was the historian Livy and the poet Virgil. I don't have data on what lives in the countryside were like in, let's say, 100 BC and what they would have been like 100 years after Augustus died in 100 AD, except to say that the people in the country were the hardest people for Christians to convert because they led a stubborn, old-fashioned life. So in part, it was their virtues that made them hard to convert. In the cities, well, it was easier to get to the cities, and there was your population centers anyways. Well, that was one reason why Christians tended to congregate there. But things were so awful in the big cities that the Christians, by contrast, they did not get divorced, they didn't expose their children, they had no abortions, they didn't sodomize boys. They looked pretty darn good. I mean, looked amazingly good by comparison with a lot of people. But maybe something of Augustus's reform did actually put a lid on the corruption in high places and encourage a sense of what you are as a Roman outside of those big cities that kept things largely together for a long time. So maybe it was in part successful. It's hard to tell at this distance. Now, the other part of the question is whether you can have something like that without major social upheaval, frankly, without full-scale war. And the answer to that question is yes, you can have it, okay? You cannot have it, though, I think, without appealing to a deep religious faith, okay? The examples, there are examples in American society, okay, and in British society. The Victorians, for instance, whom we associate with straight-laced mores, getting married and staying married and not conceiving children out of wedlock. Or if you do conceive a child out of wedlock, you get married, okay? That was an accomplishment by Victorian moralists and preachers and statesmen. And the Queen Victoria was also a part of this, a big part of this, because the morals that they had inherited from the late Enlightenment were a mess. Pre-Victorian England, morals as regards family and marriage in 1820 are in the tank. You mustn't think that they had that. They didn't. It was a concerted effort on the part of the Victorians to clean things up. And they largely did that. All kinds of Victorian writers are part of this reform, and it's multifaceted. Has not only to do with sex, it has to do with education, even the cleanliness of cities, how we take care of the poor. And both parties, both of the major parties are involved, the liberals and the Tories. The Catholics are involved, Anglicans are involved. It cannot happen, I think, without the Christian faith. In that side, did not happen without the Christian faith, but it did happen. And in America, there were several periods of so-called awakening. There was the Great Awakening in the decades before the American Revolution, largely a Methodist phenomenon. So you had the Wesleys and their good friend George Whitefield traveling up and down the colonies, waking people up and moving them to a fuller Christian life at the ground level and cleaning up their act morally. Benjamin Franklin, who fathered lots of children out of wedlock, Benjamin Franklin, about whom Adams said, when John Adams was asked whether there was a hell, he said there has to be a hell because otherwise Dr. Franklin has no place to go. Franklin, of all people, encouraged Whitefield. As he saw that if these colonies were ever to come together as a coherent society, we got to get the morals cleaned up. And that did happen. There have been waves like that in American history. Abortion in the 19th century was made illegal by a kind of moral wave that overtook the country when the doctors, especially a Quaker who became a Catholic from New England, finally discovered what the heck it was that was going on in the woman's womb, right? That in fact the being there was alive and an independent being from the moment of its conception. When they found that out, the AMA, the American Medical Association, led by the doctor, who I'm talking, Horatio Storer, MD, went on both a moral and a medical crusade. And within a couple of decades, all the abortion laws in the United States are reformed. And abortion goes from being something rather low, but will look the other way, it's not so bad, to being considered by everybody as tantamount to murder. Divorce, we had the same thing happen with divorce. Divorce was rising in the United States in the 1880s, especially out west. It had risen to the horrible level of 10%. 10% was considered to be threatening social unraveling. And the Divorce Reform League was founded to reform divorce laws, state after state, that is, to make them stricter, so that people could not get easy divorces. I mean, that was another moral movement. In the 19-teens and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there's a big moral movement regarding the upbringing of boys, especially boys who have no family, right? And it sweeps the country. It's where we get the Boy Scouts from, and boys' clubs, and Boys Town is part of this later on. It's a deeply moral and also fundamentally Christian thing, although it's open to all boys of all faiths, right? So that's happened. It's happened in the United States. We have a history of it. And those things happened without there being violence, right? Other things are comparable without there being violence, but it's utterly impossible without an abiding religious faith. Utterly impossible. I know of no case where the morals of a society will be renewed without people bending the knee to God. It's never happened. I don't see what the motivation would be. You can tell people all day long that this thing that you're doing over there is wrong. It won't matter. But if you can present it to them as an offense to God Almighty, who loves you and does not deserve to be treated with contempt, or if you can make them tremble in fear before the judgment of God, then you might get them to move. The intellect alone, never happened.